the Exodus and the mountain of fire. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a golden ocean of sand, heat, and silence. For months, the Israelites had wandered, their eyes burning from the sun, their feet aching from the stones beneath them. Yet, something greater than exhaustion drove them forward. A promise whispered across generations that they would no longer be slaves, but a free people under the care of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had escaped Egypt in a night of terror and wonder, the Red Sea parting like two towering walls, the thundering chariots of Pharaoh swallowed by the waters. But freedom, they quickly discovered, was not simple. Without chains on their wrists, they now faced a different challenge: how to live together as one people without falling into chaos. Moses, their leader, understood this better than anyone. He had grown up in Pharaoh's palace, but carried the heart of a shepherd. Leading hundreds of thousands through a barren wilderness was not just a test of endurance, it was a test of unity, of trust, of faith itself. After weeks of travel, they reached the base of a mountain that seemed to pierce the sky. Mount Sinai. Its peaks were shrouded in black clouds. Lightning split the heavens. The air itself felt alive, charged with something beyond human comprehension. The people pitched their tents at its base, murmuring in awe and fear. It was here that Moses told them to prepare, to wash themselves, to purify their hearts, for in 3 days they would meet their God. The camp buzzed with anticipation and unease. What would this meeting look like? What would the Almighty say to a people who had known only oppression? On the third morning, it began. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A sound like a trumpet blast echoed through the desert, growing louder and louder, until it seemed to shake the marrow in their bones. Fire crowned the mountain's summit. Smoke billowed upward like a pillar, and thunder rolled endlessly through the sky. The people fell to their knees. No one spoke, no one moved. Every heart pounded with the weight of the moment. Then Moses, alone, stepped forward. His face was set like stone, yet his eyes betrayed the awe of a man standing at the edge of eternity. Slowly, he began the climb, up through the jagged rocks, into the blinding smoke, toward the fire that no man could touch. What happened next would become one of the most defining moments in human history. The moment when law, morality, and divine authority would intertwine to form the foundation of civilizations yet unborn. Moses did not yet know it, but on that mountain, he would receive more than just a set of rules. He would be given a vision, a blueprint, not for an empire of stone, but for an empire of the mind. The divine encounter, the air thinned as Moses climbed higher. The sounds of the camp faded until there was only the wind, the crackle of unseen fire, and the deep rumble of the mountain itself. Each step was harder than the last, not just from the steep slope, but from the weight of what he was walking into. He was not merely approaching a summit, he was approaching the presence of the Creator. Suddenly, the world shifted. A blinding light tore through the veil of smoke, forcing Moses to shield his face. The air felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of eternity. A voice, not like any human voice, but deep, resonant, and impossible to locate, filled the space around him. It was not heard with the ears alone. It thundered in his chest, in his bones, in his very soul. Moses, he fell to his knees. "I have brought you here," the voice said, "to make a covenant with you and your people. You have seen what I did to Egypt. You have seen that I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all nations." Moses could barely breathe. The God who had split the sea and crushed the might of Pharaoh was now speaking of a relationship, of a partnership. This was no mere set of orders. This was an invitation into something eternal. Then, the fire shifted, and in the midst of the blinding light, something took shape, not an image of God, but the living presence of His law. The words came not as ink on parchment, but as pure truth burning into Moses' mind. They were simple enough to be memorized, yet deep enough to guide nations for thousands of years. "No other gods before me. No idols of silver or gold. Do not take my name in vain. Keep the Sabbath holy. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. Each command struck like a chisel against stone, shaping not just rules, but the very soul of a civilization. These were not laws for one tribe, one era, or one culture. They spoke to something universal, something built into the core of human nature. Moses' hands shook as he received 2 tablets of stone, the divine words carved into them with fire not of this world. The weight was real, but so was the realization. These commandments were not just for survival in the desert. They were a blueprint for a just and moral society, a way to bind free people together without chains. As the light dimmed and the smoke swirled around him, Moses understood that this was more than lawgiving. This was the forging of a moral empire, one that would not be built with bricks, but with hearts and minds aligned to something greater than themselves. And now, he had to carry it down the mountain. The law meets the people. Moses descended from Mount Sinai with the tablets cradled in his arms. The glow of the divine still clung to his face, though he did not yet realize it. Every step down the rocky slope was a step closer to history. But as the camp came into view, his heart sank. The people he had left in awe and trembling had changed in his absence. The shouts that reached his ears were not cries of worship, but the wild rhythm of dancing and celebration. And not the holy kind. At the center of the camp gleamed something that made his stomach twist, a golden calf. In the weeks Moses had been on the mountain, the people had grown restless. The fear of the unknown had turned into doubt, and doubt had led them to demand something tangible, something they could see and touch. Aaron, pressured by the crowd, had gathered their gold and fashioned an idol, declaring, "This is your God who brought you out of Egypt." The sight ignited something fierce in Moses. The tablets in his hands were not just stone. They were the living terms of the covenant, the foundation of the future. But here, before he could even read them aloud, the people had broken the very first commandment. In an act that would echo through history, Moses hurled the tablets to the ground. They shattered at the foot of the mountain, a symbol of the covenant already broken. The sound silenced the camp. The dancing stopped. All eyes turned toward him. "What have you done?" His voice was like thunder, but behind the anger was heartbreak. "Did you forget the one who split the sea? The one who led us with fire at night and cloud by day?" The people murmured excuses, fear, loneliness, the need for something visible. But Moses knew, faith is not forged in ease. It is tested in absence. He burned the golden calf, ground it into powder, and scattered it on the water, forcing the people to drink it. It was a bitter lesson, both literally and spiritually. Yet, even in the face of rebellion, Moses did not give up. He returned to the mountain, empty-handed but resolute. Once more, he stood before God, not to ask for personal glory, but to plead for the very people who had betrayed both him and their Creator. "Forgive their sin," Moses prayed. "But if not, erase me from the book you have written." It was a moment that revealed the heart of leadership, the willingness to stand between judgment and mercy, to bear the weight of others' failures. God, in his justice, sent a plague as consequence, but in his mercy, he called Moses again to carve new tablets. The covenant would be renewed, and when Moses descended a second time, the law was not just etched in stone, it was etched into the destiny of a people. The foundation for an empire of the mind was set, and nothing, not even human weakness, would erase it. The 10 laws take root. The second descent from Mount Sinai was different. This time, Moses' face shone with a brilliance so intense that the people were afraid to come near him. He covered himself with a veil, not because the light was fading, but because the divine radiance was too much for mortal eyes to bear. In his hands were the freshly carved tablets, the 10 Commandments, each word chiseled into stone by the very hand of God. But they were more than rules. They were the spine of a new civilization. The first laws spoke of man's relationship with the divine. "No other gods before me. Do not make idols. Do not misuse the name of the Lord. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy." These were not arbitrary demands. They set the foundation for loyalty, identity, and rest. concepts unheard of in the ancient empires, where humans existed to endlessly labor under the will of kings. In these first laws, God declared that rest was sacred, that time itself could be set apart for something higher. The second set of laws turned to how humans must live with each other. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony. Do not covet. In a world where tribes fought over scarce resources, where the strong took what they wanted, these laws were radical. They were the blueprint for trust, community, and justice. They put moral boundaries where none had existed, restraining the chaos of human selfishness. But here's the profound part. These laws didn't just shape Israel. Over time, they would echo far beyond the desert. Centuries later, they would influence Greek philosophers, Roman lawmakers, and eventually the very structure of Western law. From the U.S. Constitution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the DNA of Sinai is still there, quietly guiding civilizations. For the Israelites, however, the challenge was immediate. Laws carved in stone are one thing. Laws carved into hearts are another. Every day, they would wrestle with the tension between divine ideal and human weakness. Moses knew the Ten Commandments were not a magic shield against failure. They were a compass, a way to navigate life's moral wilderness. As these commandments were read aloud to the camp, something shifted. The people stood still, heads bowed. They had seen God's power in fire and thunder, but now they heard His will in clear, simple words. It was a covenant not just for them, but for their children and their children's children. From that day on, the Ten Commandments were carried in the Ark of the Covenant, guarded like treasure. They were not just the laws of a nation. They were the heartbeat of an idea that the mind, guided by moral truth, could be stronger than armies, richer than gold, and more enduring than empires. Trials in the wilderness, the ink of history was barely dry on the covenant. When the first tests began, the wilderness, vast and unforgiving, became the crucible where the 10 laws would either prove their power or crumble under human weakness. At first, the people walked with a sense of purpose. The Ark of the Covenant, holding the stone tablets, traveled at the heart of the camp. Priests carried it with solemn care, veiled in layers of fine linen, while the tribes moved in an ordered formation, as if the very structure of their journey was shaped by the order of the laws. But hunger is a sharp blade, and thirst is a merciless enemy. As the days dragged into weeks, the people's resolve began to crack. Murmurs spread. Quiet at first, then louder, questioning Moses, questioning God, questioning why they had left Egypt at all. The law said, "Do not covet," yet some longed for the food and comforts of slavery over the freedom of scarcity. The law said, "Honor your father and mother," but anger bred disrespect, even toward leaders chosen by God. Moses stood in the gap between divine expectation and human frustration. He reminded them of Sinai's fire, of the voice that had spoken from the clouds. But even he could feel the strain. The desert tested not only their obedience, but their faith that these laws could sustain them in the raw realities of survival. Then came the Amalekites, fierce desert raiders, skilled in ambush. It was the first time the Israelites would face organized war as a free people. The 10 Commandments did not tell them how to fight, but they told them why they must: to protect life, to honor God's covenant, to preserve justice. With Joshua leading the warriors, and Moses lifting his staff toward heaven, the Israelites prevailed. It was a small battle in history's eyes, but for them, it proved that the empire of the mind could defend itself in the physical world. Yet even victories brought new trials. When the camp reached the edges of Canaan, spies were sent to scout the land. They returned with news of abundance and giants. Fear swept through the people like wildfire. The commandment to trust God above all else was drowned out by panic. That night, the camp was divided between those ready to enter the promised land and those who wished to turn back to Egypt. The consequence was devastating. 40 years of wandering. A whole generation would die in the wilderness before seeing the promise fulfilled. But in those decades, the 10 laws were forged deeper into the fabric of the people. They were not just rules carved into stone tablets. They became the silent rhythm of daily life, shaping disputes, guiding justice, preserving unity in a land where survival demanded more than food and water. It demanded moral clarity. The wilderness was not just a journey of miles. It was a battlefield where an empire of the mind learned to endure. The laws, as a nation's blueprint, the wilderness had stripped them bare. It had burned away illusions, tested loyalties, and carved the 10 laws into their collective soul. Now, as the 40 years drew to a close, the Israelites stood poised at the edge of the Jordan River. Behind them lay the desert, a graveyard for the faithless. Ahead of them lay Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, but also bristling with fortified cities and battle-hardened peoples. It was here that Moses, now aged and weary, gathered the nation one last time. His voice carried the weight of a man who knew he would never cross into the land himself, but whose vision reached beyond the horizon. He spoke not just as a prophet, but as an architect of a civilization yet to be built. These words, he said, holding the memory of Sinai in his gaze, are not just commands, they are life. They will be your wisdom before the nations, your justice among the peoples. Keep them, and you will stand. Abandon them, and you will fall. The 10 Commandments were no longer just a desert covenant. They were about to become the backbone of a nation, a blueprint for society. They would shape laws of property and restitution, govern contracts and trade, determine guilt and innocence. They would influence how kings ruled, how judges judged, how strangers were welcomed, and how the weakest were protected. The principle "you shall not steal" became the foundation for economic integrity. "You shall not bear false witness" became the seed of a legal system built on truth. Remember, the Sabbath became a rhythm of work and rest that not only honored God, but sustained the people as physical and mental health. "And you shall have no other gods before me" became the banner under which the nation's unity would hold against the lure of foreign idols. The Israelites were stepping into a world of political intrigue, military alliances, and cultural temptations. Nations rose and fell around them not because of their armies alone, but because of the ideas or the corruption of ideas at their core. Moses knew this. He knew that an empire of the sword might win battles, but only an empire of the mind could outlast centuries. So he taught the law not as a cold decree, but as a living inheritance. Parents were to speak it at the dinner table, write it on their doorposts, bind it to their hands, and teach it to their children's children. The law was not simply to be obeyed. It was to be remembered, loved, and woven into the fabric of identity. When Moses finished speaking, the people looked across the Jordan, seeing not just land, but a destiny. The battles ahead would be fierce, but the true victory would come not from swords, but from the quiet power of a shared moral vision. The 10 laws were about to walk into history, not as relics of a mountain, but as the very heartbeat of a nation. The ripple through time when Moses spoke his final words on the plains of Moab. Few could have imagined how far the echo of Sinai would travel. What began as a covenant between a wandering people and their God would outlast empires, kings, revolutions, and entire civilizations. The 10 Commandments would become one of the most enduring moral codes in human history, not because of military conquest, but because of their power to shape the human conscience. As the Israelites settled in a land, the laws became more than parchment or stone. They became culture. Judges ruled by them. Prophets called the people back to them when corruption crept in. Kings were measured not by the size of their armies, but by their faithfulness to the covenant. When they strayed, disaster followed. When they returned, blessing flowed again. Centuries later, even as Israel faced exile and foreign domination, the law survived. It was carried in the hearts and scrolls of the Jewish people to Babylon, to Persia, to the scattered synagogues of the Mediterranean world. Where other nations faded into history, Israel endured, because its foundation was not just walls and weapons, but an unshakable moral vision. Then came the Roman Empire, vast, relentless, and seemingly eternal. Yet even Rome would be touched by Sinai. Jewish communities within its borders kept the Sabbath, upheld justice, and taught their children the ancient commandments. Early Christians, too, embraced the moral heart of the 10 laws, carrying them into catacombs, marketplaces, and royal courts. The message was clear. Power may rest on the sword, but righteousness rests on truth. As centuries passed, kings and lawmakers across Europe would find themselves influenced, directly or indirectly, by the principles Moses delivered. Medieval legal systems drew on "you shall not murder" and "you shall not steal" as basic societal anchors. "You shall not bear false witness" became the heartbeat of testimony and justice in courts. The idea that law stood above rulers, that even kings must answer to a higher moral standard, was a radical inheritance from the mountain. Across oceans and ages, the ripple widened. The moral framework inspired the Magna Carta, the legal traditions of England, and later, the founding principles of the United States. Even in secular settings, the echoes of Sinai persisted. The belief in human dignity, the protection of the vulnerable, the value of truth, the sanctity of life. And yet, the 10 Commandments were never meant to be frozen in time. Their power lay in their universality, in speaking to the deepest part of the human spirit, regardless of culture or century. They transcended stone tablets to become part of the global moral vocabulary. Today, whether displayed in a courthouse, taught in a classroom, or remembered in quiet faith, the 10 laws remain a mirror, reflecting not just ancient Israel, but the shared human longing for justice, mercy, and meaning. What Moses received on Sinai was not just for his generation, it was for all generations, and its ripple is still moving, still reshaping hearts, still forging an empire of the mind. The final legacy, the story of Moses and the 10 Commandments, is far more than a tale from the past. It is the foundation of a vision, a blueprint not just for a nation, but for the human spirit. From a mountain crowned in fire and thunder came laws that would outlast empires, define civilizations, and shape the moral imagination of billions. These laws forged an empire of the mind, an empire not built on walls or weapons, but on ideas, values, and the eternal struggle between right and wrong. The 10 Commandments set humanity on a path where justice and mercy, truth and faith, could become the pillars of society. In every age, the challenge remains the same. Will we live by these laws, or forget them? Will we honor the covenant of conscience, or surrender to chaos? The legacy of Sinai is a call to build not just nations, but communities of integrity. Not just laws, but hearts that seek justice. Not just power, but wisdom. As you watch this story unfold, remember, the 10 Commandments are not just ancient words carved in stone. They are living principles that still speak to us today, guiding the way we live, govern, and relate to one another. They remind us that the greatest empire is the one we build in our minds and hearts. If this story inspired you, if it opened your eyes to the power behind the Sinai covenant, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more mind-blowing stories from history's greatest moments. Thank you for watching, and remember, the empire of the mind is within each of us.